In 1858, London almost suffocated. Not from war, not from fire, and not even from disease, but from itself. In the hot summer, the Thames ceased to be a river. It became an open sewer. The air thickened. It was hard to breathe, and impossible to forget. People closed their windows. They hid their faces in handkerchiefs. Judges left the courtrooms because even the law could not work in this stench. The city could not breathe, and no one knew whether it would survive this summer, because the stench was only the beginning. After it came fear, panic, and death. This is the story of the Great Stink, the moment when the largest city in the world was on the verge of collapse, and how one river made London look at itself and understand how close civilization can come to its own end. If you think this is just a story about a smell, you don't know what it brought with it. London was waking up, as usual. The carriages were rattling their wheels on the cobbles. Shopkeepers were opening their doors. The Thames flowed under the bridges, quiet, heavy, steady. No one had yet called it a disaster. There was a smell, but London was used to smells. A city of smoke, a city of horses, a city of thousands of kitchens and factories and bodies crammed into narrow streets. Smell was the price of a big city. That was what everyone thought. A pause. But in the summer of 1858, the air changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. It just became thicker. It was harder to breathe in. It lingered in the lungs. It stayed longer than it should have. At first, people paid no attention. Then he began to frown. Then to cover the face. And only later did the realization come. It wasn't mine. Because the source was not in the alleys and not in the factories. It was in the very heart of the city, in the river. The Thames was no longer water. It had become a mixture. Waste from homes, waste from hospitals, waste from thousands of bodies that never asked where it all disappeared. In the heat, the river exposed its insides. The water level dropped. And what had been hidden beneath the surface for years began to breathe with the city. The smell was not just unpleasant, it was aggressive. It penetrated into houses, into the courts, into the hospital. People woke up feeling nauseous. They closed the windows, and there was no escape. The smell needed no doors. And then came the fear. Not the fear of death, but the fear of losing control. Because if the air became the enemy, where would you run? Judges refused to work. Parliamentary sessions were disrupted. Even the authorities, for the first time in a long time, were powerless before the smell. London, the capital of the empire, couldn't breathe. And that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that no one knew if this was just the beginning. Because the smell was a symptom, not a disease, a warning, not an ending. In the next chapter, we'll see how the city tried to endure, and why patience almost became its fatal mistake. At first, London decided that it could be tolerated. That's how the city always did. It tolerated the crowding. It tolerated the smoke. It tolerated the diseases that came and went, leaving monuments and statistics in their wake. The smell is not a bullet or a flame. It doesn't destroy buildings. It doesn't leave ruins. It just stays. And that's why it's so easy to ignore. The early days of the summer of 1858 had not yet caused panic. People complained, but the complaints were drowned out by the usual noise of the big city. The newspapers wrote cautiously. A few lines. No big headlines. Unpleasant fumes from the river. Unusual state of the air. Temporary inconvenience. The words were soft, almost soothing, because if you call it a disaster, something would have to be done. And London didn't like to act in a hurry. Windows were closed. Curtains were drawn tighter. More handkerchiefs appeared on the streets. Perfumes sold better than usual. Apothecaries offered vinegar, camphor, aromatic mixtures, as if the smell could be drowned out by another smell, as if the problem could be masked. But the air refused to compromise. In the heat, it became heavier. In the evening, thicker. At night, almost motionless. The smell did not dissipate. It accumulated. It settled in the rooms, in the tissues, in the lungs. Doctors began to sound the alarm, but they were not listened to attentively. Because doctors had warned before, and they weren't always right. Besides, no one knew for sure whether the smell was a danger or just discomfort. The diseases that really scared had names: cholera, typhus, plague in the memory of past generations. And the stench had no name, and that made it even more insidious. Meanwhile, the Thames lived its own life. The water level was falling. The sun was warming its surface. What had settled at the bottom for years began to rise. The river no longer flowed, it was breathing. Slowly, heavy, poisonous. The smell was different in different parts of the city. Somewhere, sharp and putrid. Somewhere, sweet, sticky. Somewhere, one that caused instant nausea. Londoners began to avoid the embankments. The walks along the Thames disappeared. The city seemed to have turned away from its own river. But the river did not turn away from the city. It was everywhere. The smell reached the courts. The judges tried to work, but the sessions were interrupted one after another. The windows were closed, and it got worse. The air was stagnant. My head was spinning. People were leaving without finishing their work. Even Parliament, the heart of the empire, was confronted for the first time with something that could not be ignored. Sessions were postponed. Documents were read in a hurry. Members of Parliament sat with handkerchiefs over their faces. The stench made no exceptions. It did not care about titles, about status, to power. And that's what really started to scare me. Because an empire that ruled half the world couldn't handle its own river. But even then, the reaction was slow. Because acknowledging the scale of the problem meant acknowledging the mistakes of the past. And London's past was built on a very simple idea. Whatever goes down the river goes down forever. Sewers led to the Thames. Waste was dumped without a second thought. The river was convenient, and for years it had been silent. Now it was speaking, and speaking loudly. But London still tried to endure, because enduring is cheaper than rebuilding the city. Because enduring is easier than admitting that the system was flawed. Because to endure is to postpone a decision until later. But later was approaching faster than it seemed. The smell began to affect not only comfort, but also health. People lost their appetite. They complained of weakness, of headaches. Rumors began to spread about diseases, about epidemics, that the stench was a harbinger of something worse. And although scientific knowledge at the time was limited, instinct told them, this cannot go on for so long. London stood on the edge, between patience and panic, between habit and the need to act. And while the authorities delayed, the city gradually realized this is not an inconvenience. This is not temporary. This will not pass. This is a crisis. In the next chapter, we will see how fear ceased to be abstract, and how stench transformed from a problem of comfort to a threat to the very life of the city. The air that started to kill. The moment when patience runs out rarely comes loudly. It comes quietly, through small signs, through the feeling that something is no longer working. In London, in the summer of 1858, there came a moment when people began to fear not the smell, but the breath itself. The air was no longer neutral. It became suspicious. People woke up in the morning and felt tired, as if the night had not given them rest. Their heads were heavy. There was a bitter taste in their mouths. Their appetite was gone. At first, they blamed it on the heat, then on nerves, then on chance. But there were too many chances. More patients appeared in hospitals with the same complaints: nausea, dizziness, weakness. Doctors could not always explain the cause, but they began to notice a pattern. Those who lived closer to the Thames suffered more. Those whose windows overlooked the river had no escape even at night. The air was not purified. It stagnated between the houses, in the narrow streets, in rooms without ventilation. London, built for the expansion of the empire, was unprepared for its own garbage. The smell ceased to be a background. It became a constant companion. It was impossible to not notice it. It was in every breath. And it was then that fear took on a new form. It was not the fear of death as such. London had become accustomed to death. It was the fear of slow poisoning, because no one could say what the city itself was breathing. Theories multiplied. Some believed that the air itself was a disease. Others believed that the stench awakened latent ailments. Some mentioned the cholera that had recently ravaged the city. And although modern science knows more, for the people of 1858, it all came down to one thing: the air had become dangerous. Judges could no longer work. The courts were closing early. Sessions were postponed without explanation. Parliament was trapped. The building stood by the river, and every day of the sessions became a test. Handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar lay on the tables. Some deputies left the chamber, nearly losing consciousness. Laws were postponed. Decisions were not made. The stench affected not only comfort, it paralyzed management. And this was the turning point. Because the empire could afford poverty in the neighborhoods. It could afford disease among the workers. But it could not afford to prevent the government from working. The smell touched what was usually untouchable. And then the tone of the newspapers changed. Bigger headlines appeared. Stricter wording. Air conditions intolerable. Thames as a source of danger. City on the edge. The words were no longer cautious, because the reality was too obvious. People began to be afraid to open their windows, but they were also afraid to close them, because behind the closed windows, the air became even worse. London was trapped. The city could not get air. And in this trap, there was a sense of inevitability, that this was not peak heat, not a temporary surge. What it is the result of decades of indifference, convenience, the habit of dumping the problem into the river and not thinking about it again. The Thames had paid back its debt, and now the city had to pay it back. But how? To change the river was to change everything. The sewers, the streets, the buildings. It meant costs that would have frightened even the richest empire in the world. So the first reaction was the same as before: postpone. Find a temporary solution. Wait it out. But the air did not wait. It reminded it of itself every minute. And in this suffocation, a thought began to ripen that no one had yet dared to express aloud. If nothing was changed, London could become unlivable. Not destroyed, not burned, but simply unlivable. And in the next chapter, we will see how the fear finally ceased to be a rumor, how it became political, financial, urgent. Because when a city can't breathe, the time for patience is over. When a city realizes there is no way out, there comes a time when even the biggest city stops pretending. London had long pretended that everything was under control, that the problem was local, that the heat was mine, and with it, the smell would go away. But the summer of 1858 did not recede. The sun rose every day and relentlessly heated the city, which no longer had anywhere to dispose of its waste. The Thames was getting shallower. Its banks were exposing the dark, sticky sediments that had lain at the bottom for years. What should have been hidden now lay on the surface, and the city saw it, and the city felt it. The smell was no longer simply strong. It had become unbearable. People spoke of it not as an inconvenience, but as an enemy. The air is poisoned. The city is suffocating. The Thames is killing us. These words no longer seemed like an increase. The embankments were empty. Workers refused to work by the river. Shops were closing earlier. Trade was booming. Shipping was almost at a standstill. The movement of goods was slowing down. The economy, the very pride of the empire, began to crack. And that was when fear rose above the level of the street. He entered the office. The officials could no longer ignore the problem, not because they felt sorry for the people, but because the situation threatened stability. The parliamentary buildings had become a trap. The sessions were held intermittently. The deputies tried to hold on, but the air would not let them work. The hall had a stench that would not go away even with the windows closed and sheets soaked in chlorine and vinegar hung up. People were losing concentration. Records were getting mixed up. Decisions were being postponed. It was a humiliating moment for a state that ruled colonies on different continents. London could not rule itself. The newspapers were writing without restraint. Cartoons depicted the Thames as a monster, spewing its stench right in the face of the city. The columns were full of anger, irony, despair. The public demanded action. But what did action mean in a city where the sewers had for decades led straight into the river? Any serious decision meant a complete overhaul of the system. And overhaul meant money. Huge amounts of money. And then there was the admission of failure. Because to admit that the Thames was a problem was to admit that the policies of the past years had been wrong. It was a moment of choice, or to continue to endure and hope that the summer would end sooner than the city would break, or to do something that London had never done before, to invest in the invisible. Because the sewer is not a palace, not a bridge, not a monument. It is something that is not visible, about which no poetry is written, but without which the city cannot live. The discussions were fierce. Some said that it was too expensive. Others said that it was inevitable. Some proposed temporary solutions: block off sections, fill in with silt, use chemicals. But everyone understood This is patching, and patches no longer work, because the Thames has become a mirror. And in this mirror, London saw not empire, but chaos. The air did not let it forget about it, neither day nor night. The rain did not help either. It only carried the stench, mixed it with moisture, and made it even heavier. The city was backed into a corner, and in this corner was born a decision that would change London forever. A decision not to act by halves, not to postpone, not to tolerate. But before this decision could be made, the city had to go through another phase. A phase when fear becomes public, when indifference becomes impossible. In the next chapter, we'll see how London, for the first time in a long time, decided to invest not in grandeur, but in use, and how one engineering idea slowly began to displace the stench that had nearly broken the city.
The man who offered to save a city.
In the most difficult moments of history, cities are rarely saved by crowds. They are saved by ideas, and by people who are ready to answer for them. When the stench in London became unbearable, when patience ran out even in Parliament, the eyes turned not to politicians and not to speakers. They turned to engineers. This was unusual. The empire was used to building the visible: bridges, stations, palaces, monuments. But now something different was needed. Something that did not arouse admiration. Something that did not adorn the city. It was necessary to save it from within. Among the many ideas, among the reports and commissions, one proposal began to stand out. Radical, expensive, unpleasant for politicians. To take the sewage out of the city. Not just to dump it in the river, but to take it outside London. The idea sounded simple, but behind the simplicity lay a revolution. For it meant building a system that the city had never known before. Sewers that worked not for convenience, but for health. Long underground tunnels, a complex network of pumps, huge collectors that would collect the waste and take it away from the center. It was engineering against centuries of habit. The man who insisted on this plan knew that his idea would be opposed, because it was expensive. Too expensive. It required rebuilding, digging up streets, noise, dust, temporary chaos, and, worst of all, the government demanded trust in science, not in political promises. The debate was fierce. Some said, "The city can't afford this." Others said, "We can't afford it now." But every time the words were uttered, the stench would come back. It would permeate the boardrooms, the corridors, the offices, and it would ask a simple question: how much longer? Because every day of inaction cost the city more than any project. People began to understand that this was not a matter of comfort. This was a matter of survival.
And then something happened that rarely happens, but changes the course of history.
London decided to act. Not partially, not temporarily, systemically. The decision was made to invest huge sums of money in something that no one would see. An underground network that would take the problem out of sight and out of the lungs. But this decision was only the beginning, because building a sewer in a city where every inch of land was already occupied meant fighting reality. Old houses, narrow streets, a river that would not cooperate, and time. Because the stench wouldn't go away. People couldn't wait for years. Construction meant a period when the city would become even less convenient, even more run down, even more chaotic. And that was scary. Could London withstand another blow, even if it led to salvation? Will the city collapse before the system is complete? These questions hung in the air, as heavy as the smell of the Thames. But now there was something new in the air. Not hope, that was too fragile, but determination. The realization that there was nowhere else to retreat. In the next chapter, we go underground, to where the biggest construction project in London's history began, and where every tunnel became a stake in the struggle between the old city and the new future. Beneath the city that didn't yet know it was being saved, while London above still argued, doubted, and tried to live a normal life, beneath its feet, a work began the likes of which the city had never seen. The streets were opening up. The paving stones were being removed. The earth was being taken out in layers, as if the city was being taken apart, to be put back together again. It was not like building palaces or railway stations. There were no grand openings here. There were no enthusiastic speeches. There were no crowds. There was only darkness. And the workers, who descended daily to dig tunnels into the stifling soil, soaked with the moisture and smells of the city. The air was even heavier underground. Here, the vapors from the river, the moisture from the soil, and the stench of old waste poured in. The lamps flickered. Shadows moved along the walls. Every sound was muffled, as if the earth were swallowing it. It was dangerous work. The ground crumbled. The walls collapsed. Water seeped in unexpectedly and without warning. People died. Not always loudly, not always visibly. The names of the workers rarely appeared in the newspapers. Their stories got lost between the lines about the budget and the construction schedule. But they were the ones who were building salvation. The tunnels stretched beneath the city like new arteries. They were not meant to beautify. They were meant to divert, taking with them all that had been accumulating in the Thames for years and was now suffocating the city. It was a race against time. Every day of heat meant new complaints, new illnesses, new pressure on the authorities. And underground time was measured differently. Here, they counted not days but meters. Another dug section, another fortified tunnel, another section where the city began to breathe in the future. The engineers worked without illusions. They knew one mistake was enough for the system to fail, that the water could break through, that the soil could not withstand, that the city from above would not even understand why it had gotten worse again. Therefore, each calculation was checked twice. Each decision was discussed. Because these tunnels were not supposed to last for years. They were to serve for generations. And while work was raging underground, London continued to suffocate above. The smell did not disappear instantly, even when some parts of the system started to work. The river was still poisoned. The city still remembered the stench. People lost patience. They wanted quick results, immediate relief. But big decisions never produce instant miracles. And this created tension between expectation and reality, between promise and process. Critics said, "We are wasting money." Skeptics whispered, "The smell will return." And the workers kept digging, because they knew if they stopped, the city would lose. And gradually, something almost imperceptible happened. The smell began to fade. Not disappearing, not right away, but there were hours when the air was a little lighter, days when you could open the window and not turn away. It was like the first breath of air after a long dive. People didn't believe it. They looked around. They sniffed. Really? But along with the relief
came a new realization. The price of salvation was high. Money, victims, the chaos of construction, and the question that still had no answer. Will this be enough? Can one system correct decades of mistakes? In the next chapter, we will see how London began to live between two realities. The old one, where stench was the norm, and the new one, where clean air was becoming a possibility, but not yet a guarantee. When the air became brittle. The first signs of relief are never joyous. They are distrustful. Londoners did not celebrate. They listened. During the day, the city still smelled of the past, but in the morning, in the coolest hours, the air became different, barely noticeable, almost uncertain. Those who had left early would stop on the steps of houses and breathe carefully, as if afraid of making a mistake. The smell was fainter. It did not disappear, but it receded, as if the city had been allowed to take a sip. People did not speak of it aloud, as if they could cast a spell, because they remembered all too well how quickly things could change. Windows began to be opened a little longer. Handkerchiefs remained in pockets, not on faces. The riverside walks had not yet returned, but the embankments were no longer completely empty. The Thames was still dangerous, but it no longer seemed a living source of poison. The city lived between two states, between memory and hope, and that was what made the air fragile, because the wind had to change direction and the stench would return. Briefly, sharply, reminding that the problem was not yet solved. The newspapers were now more cautious. They acknowledged the improvement, but they did not allow themselves to be optimistic. Temporary relief. The first signs of change. Work continues. Words became more restrained again, because excessive hope could turn into disgrace. And the authorities understood this. The construction continued without stopping. No one wanted to take any chances. The engineers insisted. It was too early to talk about victory. The system was complex, interdependent. One failure, and everything could come back. The workers continued to descend underground, every day, without ceremony. Their work remained invisible. And that was the irony. The city was beginning to breathe, thanks to something that no one could see. But at that very moment, a new threat emerged. Not physical, psychological. The fear that relief would stop the resolve, that people would think, that's enough, that politicians would say, we can slow down. History has known such moments, when half-hearted decisions were declared a victory, and then the problems returned even more strongly. Some were already talking about cutting costs, about optimization, about finishing the work ahead of schedule, because the air was better, wasn't it? But the engineers looked at the numbers, at the diagrams, at the flows, and they saw something else. They knew the system was not yet finished, that the real test would come not in the heat, but in the future, when the city grew, when the population increased, when the load became greater. This sewer system was not to work for 1858. It was to work for centuries. And it was here that London was faced with a new choice. Either settle for temporary relief and risk a return to disaster, or see the matter through, even if the pain was almost over. It was a choice between short-term memory and long-term future. The city did not yet know which solution would prevail, but one thing was clear. The air was no longer taken for granted. London had learned to appreciate things that it had previously overlooked. And in the next chapter, we will see how this crisis changed not only infrastructure, but also thinking. For after the great stink, the city never looked at itself the same way again.
When fear became a plan. Fear rarely builds a future. It usually only forces us to flee. But sometimes, when there is no escape left, fear becomes the basis of a plan. After the first signs of relief, London found itself in a strange state. The city still remembered how hard it had been to breathe, but it already felt what it was like to breathe without pain. It was a dangerous combination, because the memory of suffering was beginning to fade, and the desire to return to normal life was growing. It is at such moments that cities make mistakes. They declare victory over a problem that has not yet disappeared. But the London of 1858 had been changed. Too much had been experienced. The city had come too close to the edge. And so, for the first time in a long time, the fear did not dissolve. It remained in the minutes of meetings, in the financial reports, in the plans spread out on the tables. Decisions were no longer a reaction. They became a strategy. The sewer system was no longer a response to the crisis. It became the new foundation of the city. And it was radical, because London had never before thought on such a scale about its own survival. Construction was expanded. Plans were revised. Deadlines were extended. Not because they wanted to, but because they understood. To stop is to go back. And it was here that a quiet revolution took place. Urban infrastructure was no longer a secondary topic. It became politics. Money, which had previously gone to show projects, was now being directed underground. This did not arouse admiration, but it did arouse respect. Because everyone remembered what had happened when the invisible was forgotten. And although the smell still returned sometimes, it no longer ruled the city. London no longer reacted. It acted. That didn't mean that the fear had disappeared. On the contrary, it transformed. From panic to responsibility. From chaos to system. And that's what made the change sustainable. People began to look at the river differently. The Thames was no longer just a backdrop. It became a reminder that even the biggest city depends on how it handles its waste, that nature is not silent forever. And in this new reality, London began to change more profoundly than it seems. Not just the pipes, not just the tunnels. Thinking. The city began to plan not for a year, not for a decade, but for generations. And although no one had yet talked about ecology or used the word, the intuition was already there. To understand the limits, to see the consequences, to act before it was too late. In the next chapter, we will see how the Great Stink ceased to be an event and became a lesson that changed not only London, but how cities around the world began to think about themselves. What's left behind the stink? When a crisis passes, cities usually try to forget. They clean up their tracks. They close their archives. They go back to business as if nothing had happened. But the Great Stink did not disappear with the summer. It remained in memory. London could no longer look at itself without a shadow of doubt. The city that had considered itself the pinnacle of civilization realized how fragile it was. The Thames began to change slowly. Not immediately, not completely, but the direction was different. The water was becoming less dense, less dark, less silent. The river no longer seemed a living threat. It was once again part of the city, not its enemy. And at the same time, London changed its attitude towards the invisible. What had been ignored before was now being studied.
Sewage became a topic of discussion. Engineers had a voice. Science began to weigh more than habit. It was a slow change, almost imperceptible. But it is this kind of change that outlasts the loud revolutions. The children who grew up after 1858 no longer remembered the worst days of the stench, but they lived in a city that was built on that experience. London began to plan, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with a memory, and that memory became a legacy. Other cities watched carefully: Paris, Berlin, New York. They saw that even the capital of an empire could suffocate from its own growth, and that decisions, however painful, can change the course of events. The Great Stink ceased to be a local story. It became an example, a warning, that technical progress without responsibility turns into a trap, that nature does not disappear when it is ignored. It accumulates and eventually returns. London survived this encounter, not without loss, not without shame, but it survived. And that is precisely why its history became important, because it showed that catastrophes do not always come with a bang. Sometimes they come in the form of a smell.
In the next chapter, we will see how this experience began to shape a new understanding of the city's responsibility to its people, and why, after the Great Stink, London was never just a city again. The mirror the city didn't want to look into. There are stories that don't want to be remembered. They have no heroes. They don't have victory dates. They leave no monuments behind. The Great Stink was just such a story. London was in no hurry to remember 1858. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't written about with pride. Because it was the year when the city saw itself without embellishment, in a mirror that doesn't lie. And what London saw was uncomfortable. The city, which had grown without limits, turned out to be dependent on trifles, on pipes, on the slope of the earth, on where the water disappears after the rain. It was a blow to the idea of greatness, because greatness doesn't smell, and the stench is. And it exposed the truth. Civilization is not just buildings and laws. It is systems that work every day, even when you don't think about them. After 1858, London began to treat knowledge differently. Engineers ceased to be shadows. Their calculations began to be listened to. Their warnings were taken into account. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't perfect. But it was a shift. The city learned to see itself as a mechanism, complex, vulnerable, needing maintenance. And this thinking began to penetrate further, into city planning, into sanitary regulations, into understanding the responsibility of the authorities to those who are just trying to breathe. The Great Stink became an argument. It was mentioned when someone said, "It's too expensive." It was remembered when the temptation to postpone a decision arose, because now the cost of inaction was known. And although the new generations did not know that smell, they lived in a city that was shaped by the fear of its return. It was not a panic fear, but a structural fear. It was built into plans, in budgets, in regulations, and that is what made it strong. London stopped being self-confident. It became cautious, and that caution saved it more than once in the future. Because the Great Stink was not unique. It was the first loud reminder of the limits of growth. That cities can suffocate from their own success, and each generation had a choice: to forget this mirror or to look into it again
and again. In the next chapter, we will see how this memory began to disappear, and why danger never completely disappears. It just waits.
When silence became dangerous. The greatest threat rarely comes with noise. It comes when everything seems calm. After the Great Stink, London learned to live differently. The systems worked. The river no longer breathed the city. The air became what it was supposed to be, invisible. And it was in this invisibility that a new danger lurked. For when a problem disappears from the senses, it begins to disappear from memory. Cities quickly get used to relief. They accept it as the norm, as a given. What was a miracle yesterday is now a background. London grew again. The buildings rose. The streets became narrower. The population increased. And each new resident didn't remember the summer of 1858. He didn't know what it was like to be afraid of his own breath. For him, clean air was just air. And that's how oblivion begins. Financing began to be discussed more harshly. Voices appeared that proposed cuts, optimization, delayed repairs. Because the system works, right? The engineers warned again. They talked about wear and tear, about load limits, about the need for constant attention. But these words no longer had the same power, because there was no stench behind them. There was no panic. There was no inability to breathe. There was only silence. And silence is a bad argument. The city began to live in the illusion of control. The illusion that the problem had been solved forever. But history never works that way. It waits. It watches as memories fade, as decisions are postponed, as systems age. And then it reminds itself. Not necessarily in the same way, not necessarily with a smell. Sometimes with disease. Sometimes with accidents. Sometimes with crises in other cities, which repeat the same mistakes. The Great Stink ceased to be part of everyday conversation. It became a line in a textbook, a paragraph in history, a topic for lectures. And therein lay the danger. For a history that ceases to frighten, ceases to protect. London stood in a silence that seemed safe. But beneath that silence, the same forces were at work. Growth, consumption, waste. And if the city ever forgot the lessons of 1858, it could find itself on the brink again. In a different form, perhaps, in a different century, but with the same essence. In the next, final chapter, we will see why the Great Stink remains relevant even today, and why this story is not about the past, but about the choices cities make again and again. When a city learned to breathe. Stories usually end with a period, but cities never do. They simply pause between crises. London survived the Great Stink, not triumphantly, not heroically. It simply survived. Without parades, without celebrations, without a sense of victory. Because this was not a war that could be won. It was a mistake that had to be corrected. The air became cleaner. The river slowly came to life. The city began to talk again about growth, about the future, about development. And from the outside, it seemed that everything was back to its place. But inside, London was different. It remembered. Not constantly, not consciously, but at the level of decisions, at the level of systems, at the level of what was now considered important. Beneath the streets, along which thousands of people walked every day, there was a network that no one thought of. It demanded no attention. It asked no thanks. It simply moved the problem away. And that was its strength.
Because true civilization does not begin where the tallest buildings are built, but where people learn to clean up after themselves. The Great Stink left no monuments behind. It left behind the habit of thinking ahead, and that habit became a legacy. For London, for other cities, for every generation that believes that problems can be postponed. Sometimes they can, and sometimes they come by themselves, without noise, without warning, in the form of a smell, in the form of silence, in the form of air that becomes difficult to breathe. And then history returns, not to blame, but to remind, that cities are living organisms, and if you don't listen to their signals, they start to scream. London heard its cry in 1858, and it managed to respond. Not perfectly, not without loss, but in time. And that's why we still know this story, because it's not about the smell, and it's not about the river. It's about the limit to which you can reach when growth outpaces responsibility, and about the choice, which always remains, even when it seems that there is no choice. If this quiet story helped you see the past differently, if you like such a slow, calm look at the dark pages of history, subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell stories that don't scream, but stay with you for a long time. You can also leave a comment. Sometimes the most interesting conversations begin precisely after the silence. Thank you for listening, and good night.